Okay, today we are going to be talking about classifying numbers. What does it mean to classify a number? Well, classifying things means to put things in categories. So, putting things in categories might be something like this. Let's put this thing in some categories. Well, first of all, this thing is a vehicle, right? Now, there are lots of different categories of vehicle. So, this isn't a boat or an airplane or a train, this is an automobile. So we just classified this vehicle. Now, we can classify this even further because there are lots of different kinds of automobiles, right? There are SUVs and trucks and mid-sized cars and sports cars and vans and RVs. So we can classify this even further by saying it is not just a vehicle, not just an automobile, but it's a mid-size automobile. Now there are many types of mid-size automobiles. So there's Mazda, Honda, Toyota, Kia, etc., etc., etc. This happens to be in the category of Toyota. So we're continuing to classify this thing, meaning we're continuing to tell what category it belongs in. Again, are there many different categories of Toyota? Yes, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of Toyota. There's different models, and there's also different kinds of fuel sources. So we could continue to classify this object by saying that it is a Prius and that it uses gas and electricity, so therefore it is a hybrid. And it falls into all of these different categories. We just classified this Prius. Now, you can do this same thing with numbers. So, are there different categories or sets of numbers? Sure, there's positive numbers and negative numbers and real numbers and imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers, interesting. Rational numbers, irrational numbers, even, odd, prime, composite. There's integers, there's wholes, there's fractions, decimals, percents. There's all kinds of categories of numbers, but I don't think I need to teach you about the difference between a positive and a negative number. And I think you know about evens and odds and primes and composites, and you probably don't need to know how to put something in the category of fraction or decimal or percent. So let's talk about what's left on our list. First of all, real numbers are certain types of numbers. Not every number is a real number, but I do want you to know that basically all the numbers that you ever deal with in your life are real numbers. Okay, there are such things as imaginary numbers, but you don't have to worry about that unless you're going really far into math and maybe taking calculus or something. Okay, so for now, we're not going to worry about imaginary numbers. We're just going to worry about the different types of real numbers. So, there are different categories of real numbers. And we're going to talk about rational numbers, irrational numbers, integers, and whole numbers. At this point, hopefully you know what a rational versus an irrational is, and you know that those are two different kinds of numbers. So, I'm going to categorize it like this. On the left are rational numbers, and on the right are irrational numbers. There are certain types of rational numbers called integers. Not every rational number is an integer, but some are. And then some integers are whole numbers and some aren't. So we're classifying numbers by putting them in these categories. What's a rational number? A rational number is any number that can be written as a fraction. We already knew that. 2/3 is rational because it's written as a fraction. 0.25 is rational because you could write it as 1/4. 7 is rational because you could write it as 7/1. Negative 17 is still rational even though it's negative because you could still write it as negative 17/1. And irrational numbers are those yucky, never-ending, disorganized decimals that keep on going and going and going without any kind of repetition or pattern, like what happens when you take the square root of 13 or the square root of 14 or the square root of 15. They're just oh, wait a second. The square root of 16 is actually rational, isn't it? Because that comes out to 4. Okay, so there's rational numbers and there's irrational numbers. Again, most of the numbers that we care about in life are rational numbers, but there are irrational numbers out there. Integers are a certain type of rational numbers. So, integers are nice round numbers. They can be positive or they can be negative. So, is 2/3 an integer? No, because it's fractiony and it's not a nice round number. But 7 is an integer, and negative 17 is an integer. Integers can be positive or negative, and actually the square root of 16 is an integer because it's 4, right? Okay, so you have certain kinds of numbers are rational, certain kinds of numbers fall into the irrational category. Some rational numbers are integers and some aren't. And some integers are whole numbers. So what's a whole number? A whole number is a non-negative integer. Okay, non-negative. So 7 is a whole number. And 4 is a whole number. But is negative 17 a whole number? No. By the way, 0 is considered a whole number in math, which means if it's a whole number, it is an integer, and if it's an integer, then it is a rational number. So, these are the categories of numbers. And if you need to pause the video and write down what makes an integer and what makes a whole number, that might not be a bad idea. By the way, all of these numbers are real numbers. So whether they're rational or irrational, they're still real numbers. And all integers and whole numbers are rational. And since all rational numbers are real, then all integers and whole numbers are real as well. Okay, how about pi? What categories does pi fall into? Can we classify pi? Well, yeah, we would classify pi as irrational. Why? Because it's 3.14 blah, 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 and it keeps on going, and you can't write it as a ratio or as a fraction, so it's irrational. Now, just because it's irrational doesn't mean it's not real, so pi is real and it is irrational. That is how we would classify the number pi. Okay, how about 1/4? That is rational because it's written as a fraction, right? But is it an integer? No. It's not a nice round number, and if it's not an integer, then it can't be a whole number. Still, though, it is a real number, so it is a real rational number. 1/4 is classified as both real and rational. Let's try a couple more. What about 10/2, or 10/2? Obviously rational, it's written as a fraction. Is it an integer? Yeah, actually it is because it reduces to 5. So it is an integer, and is 5 a whole number? Well, it is a non-negative integer, so it is a whole number as well. And again, all these numbers are real numbers, so the number 10/2 is real, rational, an integer, and a whole number. That's how we would classify 10/2. One more. How about -11? -11 is an integer, right? It's a roundish number. It's negative, but that's okay. Integers can be negative. Is it a whole number? No, it's not a whole number because it's negative. But is it rational? Yeah, because you could write it as 11/1, -11/1, and it's still real. So this particular number is real, and it's rational, and it's an integer, but it's not an irrational or a whole number. So basically what we're just doing is we're taking these 5 words, real, rational, integer, whole, irrational, and we're picking which of the 5 numbers, or which of the 5 words go with that number. So, here's your job. See if you can classify these numbers. 1, is that real, rational, irrational, integer, whole? -9/10, is that a real number, a rational number, an irrational number, an integer, or a whole number? What about the square root of 99? Is that a real number? Is that an irrational number? Is that a rational number? Is that a whole number? Is that an integer? Classify those 3 numbers. Once you got that, you are all set. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, write them down, and we will talk about this mañana.